All right, I'm here with Abhijeet Singh of Stockholm School of Economics. Abhijeet, thanks for joining. I'm really excited to talk to you about this recent paper that you put out with Karthik Muralidharan titled Improving Public Sector Management at Scale, Experimental Evidence on School Governance in India. So Abhijeet, if you could just start by telling me what it was you were trying, what the research question was, what you were trying to answer, and how you went about doing it.
Hi. No, thanks a lot, Samir. The paper actually was a straightforward policy evaluation. So this was a pretty large-scale policy that was being thought of by the government of Madhya Pradesh. It was initially piloted in about 2,000 odd schools out of 12,000 in the Bhopal region of the state. And it was this program that really tried to take school management seriously. So the idea was that organizations can be poor for lots of reasons, right? Maybe they don't know that they're poor. Maybe they know that they're performing poorly, but they don't know what they can do to fix it. Or maybe they do know that they're performing poorly. They kind of know that they need to improve. They know what they need to do in order to improve, but they can't get everyone to work together, right? So there's no school accountability sorts. And what the program was trying to do was try and target all of these together. So this was developed by the government of MP together with ARC, which is leading school provider in the UK with operations around school management in a bunch of countries, and they spent 2 years developing this. So the idea very much was that you want to take the school as a whole. So you don't want to just focus on test scores. You don't want to just focus on inputs. You don't want to just focus on staffing, but you want to consider everything that happens in the school as a whole. You want to show up. You want to really try and figure out how the school works, and in a really diverse space, which is what MP is, because constraints vary not just across districts, but across villages, across schools, across principals, that you want to tell each school exactly what they would need to do in order to get better of the set of things that are actually under their control. So that's the last reason that organizations may perform poorly, that maybe I do know I'm performing poorly, I need to improve. I know how to do it. I can even get everyone in the school agreed on it, but there's stuff that I just can't control, right? So of the things that you can control, what would you need to do in order to get better across school functioning, across learning outcomes, across the social outcomes for children, engagement with school management committees and the parents, general administration, across the whole range of things that go into making a complex organization like a school work. We at the stage that we got involved in this, that's sort of midway in 2014, the state had already spent about a year and a half developing the instruments, making sure that they worked, piloting it in about 100 schools, and they were about to have the first of the rollouts. They'd wanted to target about 200 schools. And what we did was we randomized those. So on the government side, they knew that they wanted 2,000 schools in 5 particular districts. There were about 12,000 schools available. So we just randomly allocated those. And then we studied them for the next 2 years. We studied various things, and in particular, we studied two sets of things, which is, did it change accountability? And the reason we thought it might change accountability is that, an external school inspector comes in, they do an assessment, and then the cluster resource coordinator, who's basically the next level up in the education bureaucracy from the school principal, comes and asks you every quarter, well, okay, we made a plan. Here are the concrete steps that were laid out in the plan. Which of these have you actually managed to achieve? And what is the support that you need in order for you to achieve these? Right. So the idea is that this is really going to focus people's attention towards all the different bits that need to work for management to improve in the organization as a whole. Right. So we measure this in a few different ways. So you measure things like teacher absence. You show up at a school. What proportion of the staff are actually there? What proportion are teaching? We went into classroom observations. Does this make you teach better? Does this change how you approach teaching? Have you been in touch more with parents? have teachers checked homework notebooks more frequently? Right? So think of that almost as a stock measure of output. So once I show up, it's really hard for you to retrospectively grade everyone's notebook. But I can see this and say, well, how much homework have you given? Have you ever taken a look at what the child has done or not? What is the kind of feedback that you've provided? So we spent quite a lot of time trying to really think through how would you figure out something was changing? And then, of course, we eventually care about learning outcomes for children, right? So all through, we followed this both in sort of the school's official test scores and in independent assessments that we administered. And because this is a randomized trial, schools that received the program and schools that did not within the study are ex ante comparable, right? So some of them got it just because of the lottery. So you can be reasonably confident that there's nothing in the background that determines exactly why some schools were chosen and others weren't. So you can just compare outcomes across. And somewhat the disappointing thing, I guess, was that after 2 years of the program, we just couldn't see any evidence that it had changed practices or outcome. We saw that the assessments worked. The assessments were informative. They happened everywhere. So this is not your usual, or I wouldn't say usual, but this is not the frequently encountered story that implementation just didn't happen. The assessments happened, they got uploaded, they ended up being meaningful, they predict value added in later years, they predict teacher absence in later years. So if you got poor ratings, so clearly these school inspectors go and whatever they were able to observe had more information than just test scores or observable characteristics in the administrative data have about schools. It's just that nothing changed after that.
Interesting. I guess you answered my next question, which was going to be, what did you find? In terms of, I guess if you want to maybe add more detail to what you found. So basically there was kind of no change in observable practice at the school level, at the student outcomes level. Is there any kind of, I know maybe this is not a part of your study, but any insight as to what actually happened then? What is the story of these ratings that were seeming to be useful, but then kind of nothing changed then downstream from there?
So I mean, we spent a bunch of time trying to study this. I mean, one part that I did not mention was that by the time we finished the first phase of the study, and that's in 2016, it turned out that a very similar program was being rolled out nationally, and NP was going to be one of the forerunners for this. And that program, which is called Shala Siddhi, is now in over 500,000 schools. So it's already been implemented in over 500,000 schools. It targets 1.6 million schools. It's the government's flagship program around school management. And to a large extent, it looks a lot like what this first phase did, with the difference that it focuses even more on self-assessment and sort of diagnosing yourself and figuring out what you can make work in your own school. So we evaluated that as well in 10 districts for 2 more years. And again, we find basically no evidence that it changed learning outcomes. So at the end of about 4.5, 5 years of being engaged in this process, we're like, okay, can we build a narrative of exactly why this happened? Or rather, can we even build a complete narrative of what happened? So we went and we asked a bunch of schools of different kinds. So again, randomly sampled in just open-ended interviews. Tell us exactly how this played out. And our impression, at least, and there's quite a lot in the paper about this, is that essentially what ended up happening is that everyone saw the assessments and uploading of the assessments and the documentation as the core of the program. And that reflects a little bit just the structure of how bureaucracy functions across a range of domains in India, and that's true of public schools as well, which is that you get a lot of activity around the time that you're meant to finish a report and put it and upload it, and that happened. That happened nearly universally. It happened in the first phase. It happened well. So even motivated schools, that's what they thought they were meant to do. They were meant to do the assessment. They were meant to make the plans. The work of continuous improvement, which is really what this was going for, right? So this was really trying to go for incremental improvements that you make in your functioning every day, And over the course of a year, they kind of build up. That's not really observable anywhere in the system. Uh, there's various other reasons around, and we spend a lot of time talking through the organization sociology of exactly why certain practices get adopted, why others don't in the public sector. And some of that's based on direct interviews, some of that's based on our reading of the broader literature, including some really fascinating ethnographical work by Akhil Gupta at UCLA, and some classics. So it seems like this is much broader than just education in that respect. Um, does that sort of answer you had in mind?
It does. It does. Could you speak to that last point a little bit in terms of what was your kind of main takeaways for what practices get adopted and what don't, or where is kind of your thinking on this now?
So I think my so in terms of like our takeaways for the program, and a lot of that I think is in the paper. I think just taking a step back, the Indian state is outstanding at getting some things done in mission mode, right? So we can run the biggest elections, we can run the biggest censuses, we can organize some truly stupendous scale things, as long as they're time bound, right? So for example, we organize famine relief well and have from the very beginning. We're much less good at things that need to be done every day and aren't really necessarily monitored elsewhere, right? So uh, the contrast between sort of our malnutrition statistics and famine relief is probably the closest. One requires just dealing with things every single day, and school management reform is a bit like that. And that's what makes it really hard to try and crack as a problem. Uh, in the specific instance of why do governments do things that they don't necessarily think will change outcomes? Well, part of the reason is to think of, well, why do governments do things at all? And sometimes it is to at least signal that they find something to be important. And we think that's actually an important part of why the program was adopted, why it was scaled up, why it seems to have national support, why it's being rolled out across the country, right? So the act of doing certain interventions, but this is not an original insight that we have. It's from one of the classics of sociology in the last 40 years or so. So DiMaggio and Powell, uh, which is that the act of doing things, confers a certain legitimacy. That I'm seen to follow best practice. This is what everyone around the world says is global best practice. They did so the government did, in good faith, go and find themselves the technical expertise. This was based on something that seemed to be widely successful elsewhere. The specific model, at least the assessments, so not the accountability, but the assessments are based on what the UK does with Ofsted, which is their school ratings agency. Uh, it's a model that had been tried elsewhere. We show in the appendix of the paper that I mean, if you just look at projects that the World Bank has sponsored at various places, you see some variant of these kind of school management reforms across the board in lots of countries, right? But what it isn't doing is, I mean, as economists, we kind of partly approach things from the lens of incentives. It's what's changing the incentives of anybody in the system, right? And at some point, that is a limiting factor. And that's particularly a limiting factor when you start thinking of the contrast between this particular intervention and every intervention that we know actually managed to change incentives, right? So any version of, so there's various versions of performance-based pay, but there's also for civil servants elsewhere, incentives that come in from who gets a transfer where, things that are easier to achieve in the context of civil service bureaucracies than say explicit performance-based pay. So it's yeah. I think any program failure typically comes from like a combination of factors. These are ones that we think are particularly salient in this context.
So maybe following from that, you know that global school leaders, we work with school leaders, and I'm curious what you feel are the implications of your study for organizations like like mine that work with school leaders?
So an important contextual detail is that all of this, the entire study, the entire intervention was in the context of elementary public schools in MP, right? So grades 1 to 5 primary school and grades 6 to 8 middle schools, right? So that's the core of what the study focuses on. And I think to the extent that it's an intervention that focuses on school leaders, so not just like overall school management, but the very specific point person. The first step is, do these people even exist in the system? So NP happens to be particularly extreme in having fairly small schools with multi-grade teaching. And for the most part, you would have the senior teacher in the school also doubling up as the teacher in charge, right? And and then the typical school leadership kind of intervention is really quite ill-suited for that, I think. On the other hand, middle schools might work because middle schools have an appointed headmaster, they have a number of teachers, they have sort of single grade classrooms, just larger enrollment. They start looking like the schools people have in mind when they think of school leadership. So I think that is an important thing to take away, that a lot of what we imagine around education interventions is not necessarily well suited to really small schools. And yeah, I don't quite know the way to square that circle. As we were discussing off camera, there are things in the NEP about possible school consolidation. There is a large private school sector, which typically is always does have a principal and has like 10 teachers or 8 teachers, something of the kind. That's not to say that everyone does, but it's far more frequent than in primary schools in a lot of in several states. Right? So I think that would be one. The other, and I really think this is kind of important, especially in the context of work in the public sector, is that we need to take incentives seriously, and we need to take workloads seriously. So any version of a program that comes in and says, oh, hey, do these extra things in the time you have for tasks that you will not be rewarded for, in any other set of organizations, we'll be very wary of interventions described this way. And yet in education, we think these are completely, this is just how education interventions work. And, I think it's just a good thing for organizations to always take a step back and say, okay, why do you think this would work? Why do you think intrinsic motivation will suddenly pick up all the slack that exists across the system? And why do you think that your particular intervention would make inroads here when all the evidence that we have is that it's an incredibly sticky problem? So what is the exact constraint that you're solving? Is it that people are ineffective because all they lack is the information to do stuff well? Because then you can see how that would work. Is it that they lack motivation? In which case, why does your showing up for a couple of days a term change anything about sort of the day-to-day running of things? Does this affect their careers at all? So, in, for example, settings where we see these ratings work, there are often incentives that come either explicitly or implicitly. So in the UK, even though there's not performance-based pay, but you know for a fact that Ofsted ratings get taken really seriously by principals. If you get rated really low, your school gets put in special measures. If you want to move up the career ladder as a teacher, you typically move schools, or certainly if you want to become a vice principal or a principal. Right? So you need to be employable elsewhere in the public system. So I mean, Iftikhar Hussain has some really nice work on this in the UK context. So what is this? What is the ecosystem that actually incentivizes anyone to get better? And I think those are uncomfortable questions, and we would like to believe that all educators do what they do because they are deeply, deeply committed. And there are many who are, but I think for system level reforms, we do need to think about why do you think anything that you're doing would change this?
As we maybe just to close, are there other questions that you are left thinking about as it relates to school leadership that you'd like to see kind of worked on or answered in the coming years?
I think in this context, I'd actually be very curious about if some version of this type of intervention, trying to improve management in schools would work in the private sector. And the reason that I think that's still kind of important is it's a large share of the education sector, but also just more broadly that the alignment of incentives, which I was just talking about, I mean, that's much, much less severe a problem. So private schools principals have an incentive to make their schools run better, to increase market share, to be able to move on to a better school, right? So it is quite possible that things that did not work in the public sector might work there. It's also the case that the scale of the schools is larger and the scope of what they can really do, how much is actually in the principal's control, is also larger, right? So I wonder if something like this would be successful there, because if it is, then that's 30% of enrollment in rural India. That's 50% in urban India, slightly larger in some cities. So if there's meaningful change that's possible there, I mean, we should take all wins that we can at this point. And then, we should figure out models that work in the public sector, models that work in different states. I don't think there's going to be a single model that's likely to be feasible across the entire diversity of what we have in Indian education.
Great. Thank you, Abhijeet. There's a lot to think about there. So thanks for joining.